Hello and welcome to this video on intermolecular forces. So the first thing I want to do is compare intra versus intermolecular forces of attraction. So intra means within, and so this is within a molecule, and this would be examples of our ionic and our covalent bonds. And so those are very strong bonds that are holding together atoms. Okay, so when I think about this, I also think about holding together atoms. And these are very strong, so very strong. Now, we have these intermolecular forces between different molecules. They're much weaker, but they're very important in a lot of different applications, in phase changes, in boiling points, in the way our DNA is held together, in a way that we can actually read it and use those genes. And so there's three different ones that we are really going to focus on. The first one is London or dispersion forces. The second one is dipole forces, or dipole-dipole forces, sometimes they're called. And then the last one is hydrogen bonds. And so these are the three that we're going to focus on. And all three of these are very important. So let's kind of define them. So the first one, our dispersion forces, those are between all molecules. So no matter what, if we have molecules together, they're going to be experiencing some dispersion forces. The second one is our dipole-dipole force, and it's between polar molecules. Okay. And then finally, hydrogen bonds. Now, hydrogen bonds are between polar molecules, but specific polar molecules. So all molecules, okay, polar molecules, and then finally, hydrogen bonds. This is also between polar molecules, but the polar molecules have to be a hydrogen on one molecule. Okay, so hydrogen on one molecule. And either a nitrogen, oxygen, or a fluorine on another polar molecule. And that's when we get these hydrogen bonds. So they are a dipole-dipole force or a dipole force, but they're a specific kind. So let's take a look at those hydrogen bonds in water. Okay, so if I have water molecules, the intramolecular force holding them together are those lines attaching the hydrogen to the oxygen. It's just representing that covalent bond. But we know that this is a polar molecule, and we have different regions of this molecule. So the very top of this molecule is slightly negative on the oxygen region. Now, oxygen has greater electronegativity. That makes the electrons hang out with the oxygen a little bit more, and so that is the slightly negative region of this molecule. And then the slightly positive hydrogen ends. Now, if that's just an individual water molecule, not a big deal, but if we have another water molecule that comes in close contact with this, it's also going to have a slightly negative oxygen end and slightly positive hydrogen ends. And what we see is there is an attractive force that's going to happen between the slightly negative and the slightly positive regions. And that is what we call our hydrogen bond, okay, or H bond. And if we add more water molecules to the mix, we would see the same thing happening. And so when we get a lot of these, it gives the water some really unique properties. Okay, so those dashed lines are representing that hydrogen bond. And we can see different interactions similar to this with those dipole forces as well. It's just not going to be between the hydrogen of one molecule and an oxygen, nitrogen, or a fluorine of another molecule. And so let's talk about the strengths of these intermolecular forces. So we're looking at a single intermolecular interaction, okay, that are fairly comparable. This is a very broad statement and doesn't always work. But if we're looking at a single intermolecular interaction of kind of comparable entities, we would see that the dispersion force is less in strength compared to the dipole, which is going to be less than the hydrogen. Okay. Now, that doesn't always work, because when we add these up and we have different molecules interacting, the overall net result might not follow this same trend. And so there's sometimes that dispersion forces could be the thing that is causing a particular property to occur, or might be the overall kind of reason why we're seeing a greater increase in that intermolecular force. So if we're comparing dispersion forces, we're going to see that force is going to increase with what we call greater polarizability. Okay, what can cause greater polarizability? Polarizability is basically a greater net shift or distribution of electrons. So things that have more electrons are going to have greater polarizability. So more electrons, greater polarizability. Okay, so what's going to have more electrons? Well, we know that one of the things that's going to have more electrons is going to be larger atoms, okay? So larger atomic size. And the other thing that's going to be more polarizable or have greater electrons are going to be larger molecules. And so we have to consider both of those when we're taking a look at these overall strengths. And so the overall strength of our intermolecular forces is really the sum of its parts. Okay, so adding up all the sum of its parts, greater polarizability, and it's all kind of leading towards what is the strength overall. So let's do a comparison. Let's look at H2 versus F2 versus Cl2 versus Br2. Now, all of these are nonpolar molecules, right? So we have a hydrogen bonded to a hydrogen, fluorine bonded to a fluorine, and so on and so forth. And what we know is that H2 is a gas, F2 is a gas, Cl2 is a gas, and Br2 is actually a liquid under the same conditions, okay, room temperature. So what happens as we go down this list? Okay, we are increasing. So this is the smallest atom at the top with hydrogen, or molecule if you're talking about the diatomic molecule. And Br2 is the largest. Okay, which means Br2 has more electrons that become more polarized. Okay, so greater polarizability. And once you have all of these interactions going on with this greater polarizability, those molecules are going to start to interact with one another more, and that's why we see this in the liquid form. Okay, liquids have greater intermolecular forces because the molecules are closer to each other, they're interacting more with one another, versus gas particles that are very far apart from one another. And so that's one of the things that supports this overall trend. So let's go ahead and take a look at intermolecular forces and some other properties of substances along those lines. So the first one we just saw was knowing which state of matter or phase changes. And so we know things like boiling point. So if you have a greater intermolecular force strength is going to be a higher boiling point. Okay, it's going to take more energy to break apart the molecules to allow them to boil or evaporate. Miscibility is another one. So miscibility is how, like when we say things along the lines of like dissolves like. If we are mixing oil and water, they don't do that. But if we have water and, say, some other polar molecule, they'll actually be able to mix. And so miscibility is mixture of liquids. So polar dissolves in polar and vice versa, or like dissolves like. Okay, so that's the other way you can think about that. Our unique properties of water, so we have a whole bunch of unique properties of water that we usually cover quite a bit in biology, as well as the integrity of DNA. And so here's an interesting thing with DNA. So over here we have this DNA molecule. The DNA molecule, the purple, are all of the covalent bonds on the backbone of this DNA molecule. Okay, really important that the instructions that make us up are held together. Kind of think of the binding of a book. But in between these, we see these are held together with hydrogen bonds between the two halves of the strand. And this allows us to unzip and read portions of the DNA in order to make proteins and enzymes that really make us up, or to do all the different biological functions.